rational recovery, and a business humorist who will cap off the evening with his commentary. I remember when I was a child, I was explained there were two places where one had better not laugh. And one was in church. You don't laugh in church. I always wondered why that was. It occurred to me that if people did laugh, they might be laughing at the wrong things. Later on, in my graduate education, I was told very deadpan serious by my clinical supervisor and a lecturer in a social casework class. The other place that one never laughs is in psychotherapy. Because if you're laughing behind closed doors, you would wonder what the laughter was about. But when I hear Lois answering the telephone in rational recovery, you have to recognize that we're receiving many very serious calls. And I mean serious. People who are frightened, people who are desperate, people who are hopeless. And when I hear the laughter that does occur, I think, how far off could an instructor, a clinical instructor, have been to have said such a thing to an emerging clinician? Lois tells people, when you come to rational recovery, it takes two things. You got to have a brain and a sense of humor, and if you have those things, those are the basic ingredients of rational recovery. When you put those to use, you're well on your way. So without further elaboration, I'm sure that your laugh beast is now surveying the situation quite closely. I'm going to introduce my friend and associate, Harvey Dean.
Thank you very much, Jack. My name's Harvey, and I am the laugh beast. You'll be the judge of that. I was reading recently a book by Stephen Hawking, and he told the story of when Bertrand Russell was a very young teacher, and he was giving a lecture on astronomy. After this lecture, an old woman in the back stood up and said, "That's rubbish. The world is flat, and it's held up by a giant tortoise." And Russell smiled at her and said, "Yes, ma'am, and what is the tortoise standing on?" She said, "You're very clever, young man, but it's turtles all the way down." Well, of course, we now know that's not so. We know there are only 12 turtles. Compliments to Fred Edwards on a fine, stirring speech. I wish I had time to rewrite mine. In composing my thoughts on the relevance of humor in recovery, I've had a notion that a lot of humanistic thoughts run deeply within the rational process of humor. Once Bernard Shaw pointed out, he said, when something makes me laugh, I look within it to see what is true. One thing that's very striking about humor is it's so true. It cuts through the bare essence of things. It's a very rational process. I wanted also to comment on a couple other things. He said, he was telling this marvelous story of the woman with the rats, and how Dr. Ellis had changed her perception of looking at the problem in a different light. A book that has recently come to press, it's called, this title's going to make you long for the day of I'm okay. It's called I Am Right and You Are Wrong. It's a book by Edward de Bono. De Bono is a brain physiologist. Some of you may remember him from his Lateral Thinking. Does ring a bell? This book is the only book I've ever read with 3 forewords, all by Nobel Prize winners in physics. And de Bono's opening line of text is, humor is by far the most significant behavior of the human mind. And he says it is because it is perceptual. Humor can instantly change our perception of the situation. And more significantly than that, it can instantly change the feelings that are attached to that perception. We react to things because of the way we look at them. Logic, as strong as it is, has never done that. Belief systems have never come close. I'd like to illustrate a case in point of this particular case. A policewoman in Oakland was called to the scene of a domestic disturbance. This is a no-win situation for a police officer. She knocks, as she approaches the door, a television comes flying out of the second floor window, lands in the flower bin. She takes a breath, knocks on the door. Angry man's voice said, "Who is it?" She said, "TV repair." Perception changed. Where humor fits into recovery, what I'm going to try to do in coming around to this in kind of a two-phase thing. Humor affects the way we look at things. It allows us to see ourselves in the scope of a bigger picture rather than at the focus constantly. It gives us some objectivity, a chance to laugh at behavior that at one point in time might even be killing us. This is something that took me a long time to arrive at, and even with just a little bit of distance, I'm getting a picture that never was there for me before. I noted that he cited one of my other favorite philosophers about Thoreau, saying that to be a philosopher means to love wisdom and to be willing to live according to its dictates. By the time I'm through with this speech, you're going to say, well, here's a man who loves wisdom, but obviously clung to the right to live stupidly. And then following these brilliant philosophies, he quoted Penthouse magazine. I myself was married for most all my adult life, so I wasn't, privy to this type of stuff. I had the Married Man's Men's magazine, which of course was pent up. Had the same centerfold every month. All right. It was. Thank you, Ron. It was. I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about my background for this story to make any sense. I was born in 1951 in rural Arkansas, and when I was 3 months old, my parents packed up. My mom, I was 3 months, I had sisters 1 and 3. My mom was 23, put everything in the pickup truck and moved to rural Tulare County, where I spent my childhood growing up in a little town called Reedley. Now, we were fundamentalists. Well, we were Reformed Baptist fundamentalists, which means that we basically believe that God created the world in 7 days, with the exception of radiocarbon, which the devil created sometime between the Big Bang and Charles Darwin. Well, you get the idea. My parents and grandparents together moved out, and I was very close to my grandfather as a child. And I'm going to tell you a little more about my grandfather later, because he was a big impact on my development. He was a quick with a joke, lighthearted, redneck bigot that I loved very much. And he had a big effect on me. I'm going to come back to him in a little bit. One of the interesting, this is kind of an anniversary of sorts for me. This month, August 1972, 20 years ago this month, I remember sitting in a little park in Kings County. That summer, I had read all 3 volumes of Bertrand Russell's autobiography. And I had been drawn to this powerful, rational thought. And I was watching my beliefs come undone. And it was a very upsetting summer for me. And I remember it wasn't actually Bertrand Russell that did it. In the final analysis, the thinking was impacting me, but I was sitting reading a book. I don't know if any of you read Eric Hoffer's The True Believer. At that time, I had been caught up in kind of a cult thing as kind of an attempt to recover from what wasn't working. And when I read The True Believer, it scared the hell out of me. I said, I saw myself in this when he described The True Believer. And I remember sitting there almost exactly 20 years ago and knowing, I didn't know where it was going, but I knew where it had been, wasn't going any farther. And I became unknowingly a humanist thinker at that time. And all I knew to do was party. Earlier this year that I came in contact with the small book. Now, I had spent some 8 years by this point in and out of AA and NA. 8 years. And then I came in contact with the small book. The day I picked up that book, I had 12 hours of sobriety. And I had had 8 years of AA, NA, including 4 weeks at the Betty Ford Center. And I had 12 hours of sobriety, which I had achieved 1 day at a time. So, given the limited experience I actually have, I'm not here to serve as an expert or a fine example of what RR can do, as much as I am as a pitiful example of the failure of the 12-step system. That I am qualified. You know, it was Thomas Paine. I look at the struggle in this, and I heard this, I read this just recently. Thomas Paine said infidelity is not a statement of belief or disbelief. Infidelity is professing to believe what one doesn't believe. Well, my wife had accused me of infidelity, but Betty Ford convicted me. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to have to get into this. I might as well start. Before the Betty Ford Center, I had gone to meetings for some time, and my pattern was, I don't know if it was normal or unusual. I had 23 relapses in my effort to get clean and sober. What would usually happen is I would start to become very scared in the course of watching chemical dependency increase, and it became involved. Cocaine was the biggest single problem, although alcohol was always involved. And every time I would get back to the meetings where they said you had to be, I became immediately convinced that I was an addict. I had no doubt my behavior was unusual. I didn't have the usual, I didn't have the legal problems. Well, there was one, I did get arrested naked once for jumping into Sheraton Hotel pool. But it was thrown out of court on grounds of insufficient evidence. Tried in the small claims court, too. I had put 3 marriages on the rocks and 2 boats on the reef. Was it the other way around? 3 marriages on the reef? It's so hard to be sure. I had an accumulation of wreckage that was piling up, and every time I would get to AA or NA, I would start to get sober, and then as my thinking started to clear up, I started having more and more problems with what I was hearing at these meetings. I remember one time a woman very sincerely and tearfully talking about how this cat had come, and she and her husband had been having these problems, and this cat did this, and then she explained how the workings of this cat had shown the divine hand of God moving through this action of this cat. And I said, I don't believe what I'm hearing. I could have a porch full of stray cats, and I don't think I would feel any different about it. Another time, there was a man. Well, that's enough to send you out to drink, you know. It's like, and they kept saying, you know, it's AA, one-way AA. It's, well, NA, it was like you're going to do this or you're going to die, that's all. NA gave you 4 choices: jails, institutions, death, or NA. There were 4 choices there, that's right. So, although every time I went back, the jails, institutions, and death looked better and better. Trying to be someone you're not. And then when you try to explain this, you're immediately, if you say one rational, intelligent-sounding thing, you're intellectualizing. And they say, you just don't want to get sober. Have these ideas worked for you? You know, this is just keeping you drunk, and so on and so on. You go back, and then it starts, ironically, the system seems to pound the life out of you and the spirit out of you as you fail over and over and over. And then ultimately you face it and you look and say, all right, these idiots are somehow staying sober, and what am I doing with all this clever thought? Big deal. So, you know, and you hear this from them too, believe it or not. So, this process got old and long, and there was a point, actually, and one of my attempts at recovery, I knew I was going crazy and I wasn't doing well, and I called the Betty Ford Center. I had it in my head that was the best place, and I wanted to get into treatment. I knew I needed help. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't doing well. And they wouldn't take me because I had been sober for over 30 days at that time. So it was kind of ironic that after the next relapse, a friend flew me down and dropped me off at the Palm Springs airport, and as I was walking to the airport, I said, did they say 30 days or 30 hours? So I went right to the bar just to be sure. And, I wound up checking in good condition there. There was no doubt about it. I wanted to be sure I was qualified. And one of the things, almost immediately, and I knew this was going to be a problem, I had thought this through. Before I got there, I had started setting myself up to be prepared for some change that I knew had to come about. And I saw this, that I was going to have to warm up at some level to finding a concept of a higher power that I could believe in, of a loving God that would intervene, or I was hoping for some nature philosophy or something. And I was ready. I knew I needed to change. I knew I had to do something different because what I was doing wasn't working. I had started reading William James's The Variety of Religious Experiences, which actually is cited in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I found The Religion of Healthy-Mindedness, the Divided Self chapter, to be genuinely enlightening and somewhat interesting. Well, when I reported this to the counselors, they were checking me in, saying, I think I'm going to find something in this that's going to help me uphold a concept of intellectual integrity that I believed was important. Well, I tell you, they don't have a whole lot of respect for what you would call intellectual integrity for a newcomer at the Betty Ford Center. They would call it the refusal to let go completely. Yeah, self will run riot. I was a classic case. And it bothered me, immediately they gather you, and I started to, one of the meetings, I stopped and I had to talk to the counselor about how it was bothering me, this, and I was expecting it, but nonetheless it was bothering me, the religiousness, and I complained. He said, it's not religious, now hurry up and catch up with your group before they get finished with the Lord's Prayer. I'm not exaggerating by my, as I start this thing on the Betty Ford Center, there was a story about a kid who was coming home. He'd come home from Sunday school. He didn't normally go, and his dad said, well, what did they tell you down there? And the kid said, well, Dad, they talked about how when Moses was leading the Israelites out of Egypt and Pharaoh's army was right on their tail, they came up, to the Red Sea, and they were trapped. So Moses got on his walkie-talkie and he called in the Israeli Air Force, and they bombed him, and in the confusion and the smoke, he got on his cellular phone and he called the Israeli Navy, and they put up a pontoon bridge and they got away to safety. And his dad looks at him and says, is that the way they told it to you? And he said, well, no. He said, but if I told it to you the way they told it to me, you'd never believe it. Well, if I told you about Betty Ford Center the way it really happened, you'd never believe it. One thing, in reading Jack's book, so many things, it was like, aha, aha, aha. I started to see so many things in light of what had happened. I didn't understand. They took that book away from me, The Variety of Religious Experiences, and most people got their books back on the weekends. I never got mine back. They wouldn't let me have it. And I have been reading, I'm writing a book of my own right now. It's on influence, the use of humor in influence and persuasion. It's called I Laughed So Hard I Thought I'd Buy. That's true. And as I have looked at how these things work, see, one thing that's become very apparent to me, recovery doesn't have to take that long. Indoctrination takes quite a while, especially for people who think like us. Another relevant point on this is I think laughter may be as close to a religious experience as most of us in this room will ever have. So we're close to God tonight, folks. Laugh it up. When I can see the point of, Jack talks about this bait and switch tactic of a head game. They'll tell you can make the group your higher power or whatever. Well, the more I would listen to the group as these stories went on, I thought, I'm no agnostic, I'm an atheist. If this is my higher power, I'm in big trouble. Any type of rational cognition seemed to interfere with the whole process of indoctrination that goes on. So in terms of 12-step recovery, Walter Kaufman, Bertrand Russell, Ambrose Bierce, Mark Twain, Spinoza are a bigger threat to sobriety as they view it than Timothy Leary ever was. These are the processes that interfere with indoctrination. I can see it very clearly now. They didn't want that in my hands because they thought my chance of sobriety hinged on my accepting the indoctrination of that program. And they booked serious efforts. They have a staff of 140 people for 80 patients. It's intensive, and they give it the best shot of the best professionals they've got to get you to buy the program, and they think your survival depends on that. They're not interested in some of the rest of the evidence. Now, the Betty Ford Center was not a very funny place. My efforts to introduce humor to treatment were not warmly received. Sometimes in a group therapy thing I would say something that I couldn't help suppress my observations on what was going on, which sometimes came across as rather entertaining. And I remember the counselor looked at me and said, you seem to need a lot of validation, Harvey. And I said, well, am I over par? Now, this next point, this is something that really happened. And some of these things, they seem incredible. But I was in a session where they said, we're going to talk about our blackout drinking today. Well, they went through the group and people told these horror stories that they couldn't remember, of course, but they somehow came back. It must have been bad. I'm not sure I was there. Well, they came to me. I said, I didn't drink to blackout. And they said, oh, come on now, you must have, you're here at the Betty Ford Center, you know, this is pretty qualifying. I said, no, I don't, I swear I don't remember. Well, of course you don't remember, you were blacked out now, you know. And now, not only are the counselors on you, your peers are on you, a little denial here going on, Marty. Well, one of the other criteria often is most people have had a drunk driving arrest. Well, I never had that. I was kind of different and more careful, I think. I walked home a lot of nights. But, so when they pressed this thing on the blackout thing, I said, you know, come to think of it, I'm probably in denial about those drunk out driving arrests. And the judge blacked out, and the police blacked out, and everybody blacked out. It was a mass blackout, and nobody seemed to remember anything. And they didn't think that was very funny either. And the week that we have, you know, the big family codependency rally when the, you know, the spouses come down, my wife was there, and we were sitting in, you know, big trouble in our marriage already at this point for various reasons, and we're sitting in the intensive group therapy, somber stuff here, going over, and something came up about, you know, nitpicking various behaviors back and forth, and it came up that she was a chocoholic, I said, which I presume made me a cocoa dependent. In one of the other sessions, people get so incredibly serious and intense and morose about all this stuff. And I have a hard time with this. It's like, but something came about, just think if we had had AA 200 years ago, all the people that would have been affected in history and their writers. And I said, yes, Louisa May Alcott's book would have been called Little Codependent Women No More. Well, I got out of Betty Ford Center, and I got my medallion, and I completed treatment. I went along with the program. You learn to go along with it. It's real strange to drop yourself in an environment where everything is so controlled, and you are very much affected by the peer pressure. You come, they even blindfolded one person so they will come to depend on other people to show them around, help them. You learn this stuff, and you learn your dependence on going to these meetings, and you learn that you cannot survive alone without the help of this system. You learn to transfer your dependency from this arena to the safer dependency, which will also give you spiritual enlightenment and do these other things. And you come to believe this is your hedge against relapse. And I did my best. I gave it my sincere best. And I came back and I returned to the AA program, went back to my local recovery group, which incidentally is a reflection of the cross-section of the people of Tulare County. Now, Tulare County is just a little bit to the right of Mussolini, I'd say. One meeting, soon after I got back, a man talked about how, and this is one of the board members of the local recovery, 7 years, and a highly respected member, and he talked about how this guy had come and dragged his neighbor's daughter out of the house, beat her mercilessly, and he told this unbelievable story. And then it ended with, and now I can see how God sent that man to my neighbor's house, and God stopped my 357 just inches from his face. And I thought, and people were nodding in this amazement, like, how wise this is to see the workings of God in people, Cat, Smith, and Wesson. And when you think about it, when people pray in lieu of thinking, when intellectual development and knowledge are categorically condemned, when you are told repeatedly to get stupid, this is no miracle. Another time I went to a meeting and I had found an interesting study. Did I get a common chord over there? No. Another meeting I went to, I had brought something that I thought was useful, that was very interesting. It was a study about, it was a Cocaine Anonymous meeting, and they had compared, it was a double-blind study showing rats on cocaine and rats on heroin. And I wanted to share this study. The study actually showed how the cocaine rats had died off twice as fast as the heroin rats. They would go into convulsions and then get back up and do some more. And how the rats that were surviving were hawking their furniture to get more blood, stealing from their friends. Well, I thought this was a relevant thing. Well, the meeting secretary cut me off, said this is not Council of Blue-approved literature, and they cut me off cold. Now, later the same meeting, and I'm not exaggerating this, Someone had come up with this thing that was a letter from Jesus, and he carried it, and he read this thing. And I'm sitting here in amazement. I don't think this was council approved either, but somehow he did this thing, and I felt like saying, wait a minute, this is a drug recovery meeting. I think my rats have more to do with recovery than his savior. Can I, but I didn't do that. I just sat there, my character defects bristling. And I relapsed just to show them. I don't know. This went over and over. It got to be a vicious cycle. That relapse actually, the last relapse came 1.5 years, and what happened, I was getting more and more disenchanted. I just couldn't stand to go there. I just couldn't stand to hear this stuff. And I kept trying to say, Harvey, what's more important, your sobriety or just putting up with these people's religious problems? But I just felt so hopelessly misfit. And on January 11th of this year, I relapsed. And I was in unbelievable despair. I'd had 1.5 years clean, and I saw no hope. At this point also, among other things, my ex-wife came by in the morning and saw me, immediately called the lawyer. I had legal problems for the first time ever. The questions of my right to see my 3-year-old son were questioned. I was in trouble. My sister, 5 years in AA, called to basically say, how could you be so stupid? And I was astounded at I had nowhere left to go. I had pretty much burned my bridges, and now it was, you couldn't even make it after this level of treatment and this and this and this. It was a real bleak situation, and it was at that time that I, fortunately, picked up this little book. And as I started to read it, I started to say, I don't believe this. It's been here all along. I get to be me. I get to be sober, and I don't have to think all this crap. I didn't know quite how to respond. I did call Lois 12 hours after I got the book, and I talked to her on the phone, and I was amazed. Because at AA meetings, I always tell you, the most valuable person is a newcomer. Well, I've been a newcomer for 8 years, so I should have been precious to them by now. But I knew what my opinion was thought of. You're intellectualizing. You just don't want to get sober. I heard it over and over. Lois talked to me like a human being. And I knew from that moment. Now, one of the interesting things, I am a relapse hazard. One of the crazy, there was this guy, Clyde, all these times he watched me relapse, and he was one of the real religious fundamentalists who kept saying, you got to get on your knees and pray, and one of these kind of approaches to recovery. And when you finally drop this grandiose pride of yours, you're going to get sober, and when you're ready, you'll do that, and you won't do it until then, this kind of. And he told me, you are just the hardest case I've ever seen. You're just a particularly difficult case. And I ran into him recently, and I told him what was happening, and I was doing this, and he hadn't noticed I hadn't been in a meeting, so he assumed I was in the gutter somewhere. And he said, well, obviously you weren't a real alcoholic. You know, there are many incidents. I remember another time I overheard a conversation of guys I had seen at a meeting who were a local print shop, and one of them was talking about how he was going to take this trip to Mexico, but they had prayed about it, and God told them they should go to Hawaii. And I wanted to say, does God tell you what kind of toothpaste to use? You know, if so, would you just use Crest and shut up? I was getting pushed to this point, and I realized there was nowhere left to go. I came across this. It changed so many things of the way I looked at things, and we became fast friends, although we've only met on a few occasions. We've been on the phone several times. I sat down and wrote a 6-page letter. Some of you might have read it from the Journal of Rational Recovery. What I want to do with the remaining time, this is kind of what led me to this point. I want to kind of summarize what I have come to understand about the process of humor and its value in recovery and in life in general. The point of objectivity that it can give us, the point of the perception change, are the heart of how humor can bring about change. In the Betty Ford Center, I actually once asked them if I could use laughter as my higher power. They asked if I could come up with something a little more, you know, less abstract, like the one true God, maybe. You know. Laughter and humor have become the subject of serious investigation, and yet to this day, no one knows quite what the practical purpose of laughter was in the evolving state of the human being. It's like, can you imagine, you know, Neanderthals out here, and maybe, does this reduce stress when, you know, the saber-tooth gets the guy next to him instead of him, so he goes, or, you know, did it somehow take the edge off that treacherous commute to and from the Olduvai Gorge? You know? Did it make it a little easier when the creation scientists first came down from the trees, you know? I don't know. What we do know, and actually, you know, resorting from this theoretical realm back to what we do know, sociologists and anthropologists have noted the unique and universal trait of what we will go through to make an infant laugh. This is so common, it's been called a defining trait of our species. You can see a real stuffy CEO executive type grandfather, and he'll be going over a baby, you know, to get him to get a response. It is a universal, and babies who, it's the first interactive form of communication we have as children and with our children. I mean, everything else is kind of one way up to this point. Now they give you something back. It's great. So it begins early. All of us have a perfect sense of humor. How many of you feel you tell jokes well, by the way? Oh, several, God, much higher than average. Usually it's 2% of the normal. This group, 30, 40%, sure. I'm glad to see that. We need our humor, humanists. We do. How many of you feel you have a decent sense of humor, on the other hand? About 100% there. That's great. A couple exceptions. You know who you are. Yeah. Well, when you look at humor, you're not looking as much at jokes as you are looking at an attitude, a common sense way of looking at ourselves and the world we live in, and the problems we face. It was Fulton Auschler, I think, that said, humor is the sense of the absurd, despair refusing to take itself seriously. Romain Gary said, humor is an affirmation of man's dignity, a sense of his superiority over all that befalls him. Now, my dear Baptist mother, she's on her last leg with Parkinson's disease. She's down for the count. She's almost totally paralyzed. But even as this disease has riddled through her body, she did have a sense of humor. She could laugh at the process as she became unable to respond to this. To me, this is an incredible state of development. Even when we checked her into the old folks, I mean the full-time nursing facility, they go through a comprehensive check-in list, including funeral arrangements. And when they said, I mean, she's almost paralyzed, she can barely talk, but they said, do you want to be buried or cremated? She said, surprise me. You see, as a Baptist, she thinks she really will know. I mentioned my grandfather. By the way, how many of you come from families? A number of you, I see. I have two boys now. They're 9 years apart. One of them is starting to ask me where he came from, just as the other refuses to tell me where he's going. I made reference to my grandfather earlier. Now, grandfather, his name is Roy Dean. My last name is Dean. He's my maternal grandfather. When I was a little kid, bear in mind the state I came from. All right, now just a minute. When I was a little kid, you remember when you start kindergarten, you're always asked mother's maiden name, and I would put Dean, and they'd say, no, you don't understand. Go home and ask her what. And I said, that's it. Take it home. All right, take it home. I got real discouraged with this. It happened several times. I asked my grandfather, what should I do? He said, tell him our family tree didn't fork much. They never ask anymore. Granddad had an opinion on every other religion. First time I heard of a Presbyterian, he said that's a Baptist that took to drinking and couldn't afford to be an Episcopalian. And one time when I was a kid, they let me go to, this was a real liberal move on their part, they let me go to the Sunday school with my Methodist friend, and I came back and he said, what'd they tell you? And I said, well, he said, they said there ain't no hell. He said, the hell there ain't. He was typical in that regard. I became more aware of this later, more right-wing in his views than I had ever imagined. He didn't like Catholics, he didn't like Jews, he didn't like blacks, didn't care much for Methodists. He was a Baptist and nobody was going to make a Christian out of him. But this is one of the strange polarizations of our species. He could be so kind and gentle to me. I knew how important I was to him. He would sit me up on his knee and he'd say, tell me a story. And he would listen to me. And he cared about what I said. And this is one of the funny things, because he had this real in-group kind of care. If you were in his group, he'd do anything for you. If you were out of it, to hell with you. And that's the way he was. And among other things, I remember once I was reading my weekly reader and I said, Granddad says here it took 150 million years to dig the Grand Canyon. He said, whoa, what is it, a government project? And he used to talk about the ranch, the cow. He missed the dairy ranch we had, and he longed for the days of the farm and all that. And I said, was it a big ranch? He said, the name of it was the EWE, Lazy Double Diamond Circle Q Bar, 9 lane to the right ranch. I said, was it a big ranch? He said, big. Wait a minute, I got the thought. I'm a professional, this isn't supposed to happen. I'm having amnesia and deja vu at the same time. No, I said, did you have many cattle? He said, not too many to survive the brand. But he smoked Roll Your Own Prince Alberts when I was a kid, graduated to the little short Camels with no filters, and eventually they got to him. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, and one of the strange, funny twists of his life was he when he was getting treatment for this, he was very resistant, and the only available oncologist was a young Chinese intern, and this did not fit with his attitude at all. He wouldn't cooperate with his treatment, and the doctor asked him why, and he said, well, when he would explain that when he was a kid, his uncle, who was diagnosed with diphtheria and died of pneumonia, and this frustrated oncologist said, I assure you most patients I treat for lung cancer die of lung cancer. Dr. Lawrence Peter said, he said, a sense of humor is deeper than laughter, delivers more than comedy, and is more satisfying than merely being entertainment. A sense of humor sees the fun in everyday experience, and it's more important to have fun than it is to be funny. And as Woody Allen put it, why take ourselves so seriously? No one's getting out of here alive. I like another Woody Allen quote. He said, it's a dog-eat-dog world, and I've got my milk-bone shorts on. And he's got his milk-bone shorts on right now. Boy. A lot of what we're talking about is the capacity to laugh at yourself. If you develop the ability to laugh at yourself, it can carry you through so many of life's difficult circumstances, and you won't miss the best joke of your own generation. I think a good... How many of you, by the way, have jobs, I would imagine? A lot of the stuff of this philosophy translates to work, to life, to recovery, to living. It's very much aligned with this notion of experiencing the joy that this day gives us. Whenever you find yourself laughing, you are in this moment. As Usher said, we're caught between two thieves. The worry about yesterday, the guilt about yesterday and the worry about tomorrow, forever depriving ourselves of what we have right now. When you are laughing, you are in this moment. This is something it can always bring home. You can never do it any other time. Don Peterson of the Ford Motor Company said, there's no market for lousy cars. We tested it. You know, in the health picture, any of you familiar with the Norman Cousins story? Sure. Yeah, several of you. This, for those of you who aren't familiar, those who have, bear with me for a moment. Here is a man who was diagnosed with a fatal and debilitating disease of his connective tissue, literally coming unglued. He had a 500 to 1 chance to survive. No one had ever survived this. All they could do was pump him full of drugs to make him comfortable until he died. And he noticed, as he watched the course of this disease riddle through him, his demoralization and despair became pronounced. And he watched as his attitude deteriorated, he could watch the disease speed up. And he thought he had nothing to lose. He said, what if I was to introduce love, laughter, hope, will to live, if I could bring some of these emotions back, what have I got to lose? He actually, one of his friends was Alan Funt. He sent down a 16mm camera with some old newsreels. He got some Marx Brothers comedy films. He had the nurse read him jokes for hours on end. He found if he got 10 minutes of solid belly laughter, he would get an endorphin type of an effect that would relieve the pain in his body, which had felt like a truck ran over him when he did most of the time. And he could actually get 2 hours of sleep. Well, the sleep, to make a long, amazing story short, was the turning point. He also, one of his friends was Linus Pauling, and Linus Pauling had induced him to try massive amounts of vitamin C, which he went along with. And some people wonder what would have happened if Timothy Leary would have been one of his good friends. The point is, the laughter actually altered the course. Eventually, he started laughing so much that it bothered the other patients, and they had to move him out of the hospital to a hotel where the food was better, and he made a complete recovery. The New England Journal of Medicine wrote up this amazing case. Now, one thing, Norman Cousins then committed himself to a study. He went down to the UCLA Medical Center. Now, he's an editor. He's a New Yorker magazine, I think, for many years there. Fine writer. Very, pardon me? Saturday Review. Pardon me. Boy, got a crowd of intellectuals here. Are you literate? My gosh. Thank you. Saturday Review. I stand corrected. And one thing, the first thing he did, he took a look at a case of 262 cancer patients, and what he noticed was how the disease had progressed concomitant with the diagnosis of the disease. And the question that he addressed was, if emotions can so severely impact the course of the disease, can positive emotions affect repair, recovery, and health? And with collaboration from Dr. William Fry at Stanford and some other remarkable physicians, the answer was a resounding yes. Attitude has a direct correlation. Now we know from the study of psychoneuroimmunology that the stress factors affect the immune system's capacity to respond. So what we're getting at is laughter has a very direct correlation with our ability to recover and fight off disease. Also, those of you who are in the mental health fields probably know that the single biggest indicator of good physical health is good mental health. People who have a good attitude tend to be healthier. And this is one thing that laughter can do on a regular daily basis. It's a remarkable story. And it's one of the things I think has direct bearing on the issues of rational recovery. I don't have a whole lot of time, but I want to give you just a little bit to take with you. So much of the time, many of us have been damaged in our efforts to develop our sense of humor. I want to just give you a few pointers, if you will, on ways you can communicate your sense of humor, which will open up, because more than half the time, more than half the people will meet you more than half the way if you communicate your sense of humor effectively. Would more than half of you agree with me on that? Just one very easy way. I'm going to give you about 5 of these. Find a humorous quote that's relevant to what you do. There are relevant quotes in the field of therapy, in the field of any realm of work, almost anything you can imagine. There are humorous, thoughtful, provocative quotes on. As you become familiar with these, they'll start to affect your thinking. They may affect your reading. Some of the brilliant philosophers have said very funny things. And so you can find these, and you make it relevant to what you're talking about. Relevance reduces resistance. If you try to just tell a joke, often people will resist you. They put up a comedy chip. So find it. It takes a little bit of editing work, a little bit of creativity to apply it to what you're doing. By the way, another pitfall to stay out of is, those of you, I know that many of you tell jokes, memorize the punchline. Let me tell you a little story about, there was a Baptist minister in the town I grew up in, the church I grew up in, and he had a habit, he would foul jokes up, he couldn't remember the punchline. Also, he was very boring, he would put people to sleep. So, he asked the old retired minister, what do you do in a case like this? The guy said, well, he said, I look out over the audience, say, last night I found myself in the arms of another man's wife. He said, well, that gets their attention. And I say, it was the arms of my dear old mother. They kind of laugh, I make it through to the end. So the young minister said, I can do that, I can do that. Don't get ahead of me. The next Sunday, there it goes down. So he looks out and said, last night I found myself in the arms of another man's wife. Well, the congregation went into shock and the preacher went blank. And then he started out, yeah, I can't remember who it was. So memorize your punchline. One other thing is remember brevity. Shakespeare said brevity is the soul of wit. Can't say enough about brevity. Another little trick. you can tell about a cartoon that will illustrate your point easier than you can tell a joke. There's less ego involved. Just describe it. I think of, one of my favorite political cartoons of an election 4 years ago, when the different candidates were fighting the image the press had given them. When Paulson saying, "Don't call me a televangelist," and Bush is saying, "Don't call me a wimp," and Gary Hart's on the phone saying, "Don't call me at the office." Well, you can describe a cartoon and people form the pictures in their head, and there's very little involvement with that. Cartoons in general are a good way. You can fax them, show them, display them. They are a way of expressing your humor. Another good way is little signs that often can even diffuse problems that are common. I have a sign, I own a sign shop, is one of my interests, and we had a problem. Customers would come in, they couldn't, there was often no one in the waiting area. And we put in a little bell, you know, but the plotter for our machinery was louder than the bell, so they still wouldn't get attended. Well, my 2-year-old left a little Nerf football out there, and so one annoyed customer picked up the football and listened to the voices and let it fly. And he hit David Harris right in the head. Well, David laughed, came out, customer was laughing. That's it. So we got a whole basket full of Nerf balls now. And I made a little sign that said, "For customer service, please throw Nerf balls at employees." Of course, you come to this right after the little sign on the door that says, "Sorry, we're open." You know, by the time you get that, you know what kind of people you're dealing with. And you can communicate your sense of humor. Another interesting thing is euphemisms. Euphemisms are words, of course, which kind of round off the sharp corners of truth, kind of a little mix of humor and motivation. I had my operations manager said, "We have a problem with our art director." I said, "Say, unresolved opportunity." He said, "Okay, we have an insurmountable opportunity with our art director." But the choice of words can affect. This isn't just a happy, positive thing. It just makes people look for the positive outcome in a situation, which makes you more likely to find it. It's like looking for humor. It's kind of like putting the old candid camera crew on your head saying, "There's something funny here, and I'm going to find it." You look for trouble, you're probably going to find it. You look for something funny, it's usually there. My grandfather that I mentioned earlier, he had a funny way of looking at things, and it reminds me, once I was trying to see the funny thing in a situation, a work-related thing, and I remember something he said. He had taught me how to hunt and fish in the Arkansas tradition, and the first time I came out of the woods, I was 13, I said, "Granddad, I didn't even see any deer." He said, "Trouble is, you're looking for the whole deer." He said, "You got to learn just to spot a flick of a tail or an ear." He said, "If you can spot part of that critter, I can guarantee the rest of it's real close by." Well, finding humor in situations is a lot like that. It doesn't jump right out and show itself to you, but you can learn to spot it. You can train your eye, train your sensitivity, and it's a fun way to go through the day. I used to be a drug salesman. How many of you have done that at one time or another? Well, I was in pharmaceutical sales. Oh, sorry. Officer? Yeah, it's coming in. This one right here. No, actually, it was kind of a crazy one. We were sent back for 4 weeks of intensive training on medical education. Some of you may have known detail people. There's some psychiatrists in the room, I think. We sold psychoactive drugs, Thorazine. I used to come up with the doctor and say, "You can go back to Kansas anytime, Dorothy, with Thorazine." And we had an ultra-low dose birth control pill. I'd say, "This dose is so low the Pope won't even notice it." You know, things you could do. Once, we always drove around with a trunk full of samples. I went across the Mexico border and I was coming back, and the U.S. Customs guy said, "You got any drugs?" I said, "What do you need?" You know, I want to start wrapping this up because it is late. You've been a very kind audience. I would add one more very powerful tool to this little repertoire: the personal anecdote. Much as you might not believe it, people would rather hear about you, your grandkids, your job, your circumstances, some funny story that you were already telling. They'd rather hear that than they would a joke. When you tell the personal anecdote, you have the best of the humor experience combined with a sharing of something that happened to you that's real. I did a humor program for a surgical center, and we had a breakout session where people shared different anecdotes, and the lab receptionist told us one story. She said, "I told the man in my very best receptionist voice, 'Please go around the corner. Please place your lab slip and your specimen through the window.' And the man peed right through the window." She he said I went home early that day. One of the common objections to using humor as a regular means of communicating ourselves is the concern that, yeah, it's great when everyone loves everyone, everyone's happy, everyone's great, but what about when the chips are down and things are tough and things are difficult? Well, I would say that that is when humor has the real chance to show its real power. Humor has been defined as the willingness and ability to access joy in adversity. This is an act of will that we can exercise and we can learn. This is a learnable skill. The last year has given me a chance to test that theory. I have been provided with a number of opportunities, you might say. I had my marriage downsized. 50% reduction of personnel. 97% reduction of assets. I turned 40. That was bad enough in itself. But on my 40th birthday, my 2-year-old child, almost 3 at that time, was attacked by a rabid bat. No joke. And it took a while to see what was funny about that. Let me tell you how this came out. That was just a few months ago. I took my dog into the vet to get foxtails out of her ear. And I saw the vet's name on the wall, and I thought, could it be? And because I had never seen what had happened. And I went and I said, were you interrupted from travel plans about 6 months ago to dissect the brain of a bat that had attacked a 2-year-old boy? He said, yeah. Was that your bat? Well, I explained, and then he said, let me show you something. This is a 60-year-old country vet, 60-something, and he pulled out this, opened an old desk drawer, and there was a thing that said bite list with a list of names on it. And he said, you see this? He said, all of my life I've been working with these rabid animals. He said, one of these days one of them's going to bite me, and this is the list of people I'm going to go bite. Well, the events of that series led me to the concluding story here, which I was one who always prided myself on my ability to communicate well with people, to talk, to get things going, and the thing with my ex-wife deteriorated to a point where it was, have your lawyer call my lawyer. Things went from bad to worse. Things looked devastating. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to keep my home or my business. I wasn't sure where it was all going. I went in one day and I was talking, it was my lawyer had called me in to tell me that she had retained the most expensive attorney in town to overturn my prenuptial agreement, and I was sitting here saying, I can't believe this. I can't believe it. He said, well, believe it, it's real. This is on my 40th birthday. A month later, as things had gone from bad to worse, he was talking to me, my lawyer, who was a very compassionate, kind man, and he saw the despair to which I had fallen, and he said, how's Conrad? Well, the night before a thing had happened, I just told him this little story about how he's sitting up in his car seat. We go to pick up my nanny's high school son, and he's not where he's supposed to be in front of the gym. So we drive around the front, he's not there. We drive back around the gym, he's not there. Well, my kid is watching me get increasingly frustrated, and in a preemptive strike, he slams his little fist down in his car seat and says, I can't believe this. Well, I told my lawyer this story, and he laughed, and I laughed, and the whole mood changed. And I said, I got an idea. Can you arrange a 4-way meeting? Her lawyer, we'd done this before, and it had all fallen apart. And he said, yeah. So 2 days later, we sat, and I told this story. And her lawyer laughed, she laughed, I laughed, my lawyer laughed, and I said, I got an idea. We had arrived at a point where we were basically in dispute over $10,000. And I said, why don't we just take the disputed amount and set it aside as a junior trustee for Conrad's college education and end it right now? And my ex-wife looked up and said, yeah. And her lawyer looked over in astonishment and said, can you? And he said, you guys will put lawyers out of business. and my lawyer said, he said, it'll serve you right if he goes to law school with that money. And in 5 minutes, it was over. And we walked out, my wife, ex-wife and I, and for the first time in months, we looked at each other. And we stood there, and she said something, I don't remember what it was, and we both laughed, and we cried. And we said, you know, we almost lost sight of the real victim of what was going on here. And we can keep our sense of humor. We've got a child to raise here, and we can talk, and we can get along. And that's what we're doing now. And this kid is fine, and things are going to be fine. I think it's in no small measure what my mother taught me about my sense of humor and about how it got me to a point. I look back, I had written in my journal in June of 1987. I didn't know where this was going to go at the time, but I kept a journal since I was 15. And I put, oh yes, about higher power, after considerable prayer and effort and the feeling for a strong need for a belief in a God, I was able to come up with a religious experience last December 20th. I might as well acknowledge what I really think. I think nothing is so easy as to deceive ourselves for that which we wish, that we readily believe. I wish there was a God, and there may be, but he is not elected to break his anonymity with me. When I pray, there is value, because I'm focusing on what I care most deeply about, and I hear and internalize the message. I'm not sure, but rather than continue to try to find a God I can believe in, whose gracious hands will accept my problems, I'd better find something that does work, while there is yet time. While I write this calmly, the nature of the problem is anything but calm. No more statements of emotional zeal, low on drugs or high on God. I've got to dig in and fight this son of a bitch until I beat it. And I will stay with it until I succeed. And if I take knockdowns, I will get up, and continue to get up, until the foe is defeated, which may be never, but I will never give up and never give in. I feel like I made it. I'm very grateful to Jack for founding this movement, for writing this book. My notion is there are millions of people like me who are floundering, who simply need some guidance and some help. I think people in this room can help implement the way to change the quality of life for these people and for the society we live in. You've been a very gracious audience, and thank you.